I must speak about David Stowe, who was my mentor in philosophy, and especially his work on probability and rationality of science. Like myself, he was an Australian. We speak a version of English that you don't hear on television very much. I hope you can tune into it. I'll speak briefly about his life in a moment, but you won't be motivated to listen to that unless you have some idea of the basics of what he said. So first, here are a few of his take-home messages. First, the probabilistic nature of evidence to conclusion is logic. That means that in cases like whether an accused is guilty beyond reasonable doubt, or the evidence that, whether the Big Bang hypothesis is credible on the evidence, it's an absolutely objective matter how well supported the theory is by the evidence. That is, the probability of the theory on the evidence. Different people may have different views, but if so, one is right and the others are wrong. Secondly, deductivism, the thesis that the only logic is deductive, is evil, as Greg has said earlier. It's been common to think that deductive logic, as in mathematics, that moves with certainty from premises to conclusion, is the only logic, and that there's no such thing as the probabilistic logic that I've just briefly described. And follows from that the philosophy of science of Popper, Kuhn and others is a disaster. Those thinkers dominated philosophy of science in the mid-20th century, and they were deductivists, so in reality they undermined the rationality of science. And next, Stowe argues that induction is justifiable by the logic of probability. Induction means inference from the past to the future, or generally from the observed to the unobserved, or from sample to population. It's been a long-standing philosophical problem as to if and why it's justified. Stowe offers a solution. He said some other things. He had controversial views such as a deep, in-principle political conservatism, an argument that women are on average less intelligent than men, and opposition to some parts of the theory of evolution, but they are not so relevant to today's topic, so I won't be talking about those. This is his most prominent book in two versions, attacking Popper and Kuhn's philosophy of science. Well, briefly about his life. David Stowe was born in rural New South Wales in 1927 and attended Sydney University in the late 1940s. He was much influenced by the dominant figure in Australian philosophy, John Anderson, and took up philosophy as his life profession. He married and had two children, both now successful writers. There are not many photos of him. He was shy of the camera, but here is one of him mowing, real mowing, in 1956, and another one of him and his wife Jess in the middle, and another friend in the 1970s. Well, then, up in the 1970s, he wrote his first book, Probability and Hume's Inductive Skepticism, which identified deductivism as the error in the hugely influential arguments of the 18th century philosopher David Hume that induction is not justified. I studied with him in 1973, and he kindly gave all of us students typescripts of his book. Being in the humanities faculty in the 1970s and 80s was, of course, a severe trial for anyone of conservative inclinations, and Sydney University philosophy was among the worst departments for political trouble. He survived, but not easily. When he took early retirement in 1986, his parting shot was an essay, Farewell to Arts, which began like this. Yes, indeed. And interesting that the next few sentences continue like this about science. He says, well, his problem is not there in science. So I wish you were back today to see if he would repeat that or think things had gone down the tube in science as well. I'm not sure if he'd say that today. In the meantime, he'd written the book I mentioned earlier, Popper and After, Four Modern Irrationalists, attacking the deductivist errors of Popper, Kuhn, Lakatos and Feyerabend. He continued to write in retirement, notably a book Darwinian Fairy Tales, about the logical flabbiness of the sociobiology approach to evolution. This is a picture of him late in life, looking rather severe, which is typical. Sadly, he was a heavy smoker and developed esophageal cancer. A major operation left him severely depressed, and he committed suicide at age 66. Now, let me explain in a little more detail the basics of his ideas, in concentrating on the more positive ones rather than the polemics against Popper and others. Those polemics follow from the positive ideas. The most central idea is logical probability, that the relation of evidence to conclusion is a logical one. The main founder of that idea was John Maynard Keynes, best known as an economist. He started out with a book on probability before he went on to an easier topic. Other notable defenders were Rudolph Carnap and E.T. James, and much the same idea is recently popular among some statisticians under the name objective Bayesianism. The point of that idea is that whether a theory is supported by evidence or not is it's not itself a scientific discovery, but it's prior to science. It's like logic in mathematical reasoning, something absolutely objective and the standard by which you judge other theories. It has nothing to do with science. It's the same across evidence in law, like proof beyond reasonable doubt, in the evaluation of historical theories, in detective work, medical diagnosis and so on. Anywhere where you have data, evidence, observations that support or don't support, as the case may be, some theory or hypothesis. Also, obviously, logical probability is fundamentally important to nearly all our thinking. It follows that deductivism, the thesis that there is no such logical relation, and hence that the only logic is deductive logic, is very corrosive of rationality. Well, let's say corrosive of virtually all rationality outside pure mathematics and logic itself. If you start thinking that way, you'll soon be claiming that if theories aren't maintained because there are good reasons for them, they must be maintained for political reasons, like patronage or state propaganda, or maybe psychological ones, such as ego defences, or whatever is the latest. Karl Popper, in his book The Logic of Scientific Discovery, and Thomas Kuhn in The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, did hold deductivism, and so in effect concluded that science could never genuinely advance through the accumulation of evidence. Those two books dominated philosophy of science in the mid and late 20th centuries. That's why Stowe wrote Popper and After Four Modern Irrationalists, to explain where they'd gone wrong. It would be a pity if we missed the fact that Stowe's prose can be very funny. Here is a comment about Popper, at one point talking about the soaring edifice of science, which he, Popper, thinks is really unsupported by evidence. So Popper has written a book called The Logic of Scientific Discovery, saying that really there is no logic of scientific discovery. Stowe compares that to Aesop's fable of the fox and the grapes, where the fox can't reach the grapes and says they must be sour. Stowe says this. So it's all very well to say that logical probability exists, but we won't understand how to actually determine if theories are well supported unless we understand what the principles of logical probability are. There are two basic principles. They're easy to understand and they're very intuitive, but as Stowe pointed out, have a strangely low profile in discussions of rationality. They're the confirmation of theories by their consequences and the proportional syllogism. Let me explain them. Confirmation by consequences. Well, it just says that if a theory has consequences, and those consequences are found to be true, then the theory is confirmed, meaning it's more probable than it was to begin with. Not many people have talked about that principle explicitly, but George Polya rightly called it a fundamental inductive pattern. So the detective reasons that if the butler did it, the knife should be behind the sofa. If the knife is found behind the sofa, so the theory that Butler did it is more probable. Einstein's general relativity predicted hitherto unexpected bending of light from distant stars. They went out to West Africa and observed it, so relativity was confirmed. And as in these cases, it's initially unlikely predictions that best confirm theories. So does consequences mean predictions? Well, mostly it does. Consequences often means predictions. It's a prediction of a theory. It's the consequence of the theory in the case of the data that you're going to observe, but not always. For example, if a conjecture in pure mathematics implies some known result, that confirms the conjecture. And it's very interesting that the principles of logical probability apply in pure mathematics, which shows how much they are a matter of logic. They're nothing to do with uniformity of nature or anything like that. We're at a much deeper and more logical level than any scientific facts. Well, the second principle is the proportional syllogism, also called the statistical syllogism or direct inference. Stowe especially called attention to its neglect. The word syllogism refers to the form of deductive inference known since the ancient Greeks. It's like this: all men are mortal, Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal. The example is an ancient one because philosophy takes pride in being a hidebound and traditionalist discipline. If you know the two premises are true, it follows with certainty that the conclusion must also be true. So far, so simple. Now, what about this apparently quite similar argument? Well, it's called proportional because it argues from a proportion in a population, but the proportion is less than 100%. Well, if you know the premises are true, it's certainly possible that the conclusion is false. So it isn't a deductive form of inference. Nevertheless, the premises provide good reason to believe the conclusion. Nearly all men are mortal. What could be better evidence that a particular one is? That sort of reasoning is everywhere in everyday life. Nearly all flights arrive safely, so you relax on takeoff. Most people with your disease improve with a certain drug, so you take it. Note that it doesn't say Socrates is a randomly chosen man or anything like that. Of course, if you have further evidence about Socrates, maybe such as he's a special friend of the gods, then it might not be reasonable to conclude that he's probably mortal. But that, of course, changes the premises. It adds in premises, so it's a different argument. It doesn't suggest that there's anything wrong with the original argument. The original argument just says respect the frequencies. If the great majority of something is such and such, expect that one of those things is that way. Especially interesting is the justification of deduction using the proportional syllogism. It was published originally in, not by Stowe, but in The Ground of Induction in 1947 by the American philosopher D.C. Williams and defended by Stowe in The Rationality of Induction in 1986. The argument is this: the vast majority of large samples approximately match the population composition. That's a truth of pure mathematics. So the situation we're thinking of is something like a very large, like with thousands, a box with thousands of balls, black and white, of an unknown proportion. And it's a mathematical fact that most large samples, meaning not necessarily the whole, nearly the size of the population. Large means 500, let's say. And this is a large sample. You've got a large sample, therefore it matches the population, meaning probably. And that's the same thing as saying the population probably matches the sample. Again, match means approximately match. I'm thinking most people are thinking they're losing the track of it a little. It's something you can't get in a few seconds, and I can really only advertise it. That's a logical justification of induction, and it implies, for example, that induction works in all possible worlds, ordered or otherwise. Now, what about justifying hypothesis testing with p-values using a proportional syllogism? Interesting question. Well, that's all I wanted to say about those two particular principles. Those two principles fit into, those two principles, the confirmation of theories by their consequences and the proportional syllogism, fit into more general Bayesian and maximum entropy theory, which you can study if you want to become an expert in these matters. Finally, let me mention 3 of my books that arose from what I learned from Stokes. The first is, in the middle of the first book written, is The Science of Conjecture, Evidence and Probability Before Pascal. It's a history of evidence evaluation, uncertain evidence evaluation, before the mathematicians got onto the theory of dice in the 17th century. The central topic is the medieval law of evidence, where they developed concepts like modern proof beyond reasonable doubt, but it also has scientific theories, such as Galileo's thoughts on the probability of the Copernican hypothesis. Second book, What Science Knows and How It Knows It, is an overview of the rationality of science, starting with the rationality of induction, probability in other fields, plus some sceptical thoughts on the failures of what we might call actually existing science, their failures such as the refereeing process. The refereeing process has some positives, like giving people rude anonymous feedback that they wouldn't get from their lab assistants, but as people have said, that has its downside. David Stowe wouldn't have agreed with the third book, The Worth of Persons, The Foundations of Ethics, but it still owes a lot to him. It defends the absolute objectivity of ethics, comparing it to the objectivity of the relation of evidence to conclusion. Well, for more, I maintain a David Stowe website with many of his writings and reactions to them. Thank you. Talk to me later.